Wait, the obligatory few seconds. And I believe we're all good. So, Dark Bleatings, everybody. I have Dan Coxon with me today, who is an author of some truly excellent short stories that I was raving about all through December and the start of January. Also an editor. I have some anthologies of yours, or at least one right next to me in paperback, Dan. So, welcome. Thanks for
Hello,
being.
thank you for having me.
Would you like to tell people a little bit about yourself for the uninitiated?
Yeah, it's confusing. It's
Go
probably the
on.
hardest. It's probably the hardest question for me to answer normally because I do bits of everything. So, I mean, this morning I was doing my day job, which is proofreading and copy editing. So I do work as a proofreader and copy editor and as a structural editor for various publishers. But then I'm also a writer and an anthology editor, as you mentioned as well. So I kind of do a bit of all of it, and not all horror either. So it's other genre fiction and things as well. It's largely horror still with my own writing, but kind of dipping the toe in the water elsewhere with that a bit as well. So it's kind of a bit of everything, booky stuff.
Yes, I was gonna say it sounds very bookish. So yeah. So horror is your main interest for when you're writing. Is that what you like to watch and read the most as well?
Do you know what? It probably isn't. It's probably actually the other way around. It's probably that it's the thing I like writing, and probably some of my like favorite books of all time. I think are horror or kind of horror adjacent at the very least.
Mhm.
But I read really, really widely. And always have done. And at the moment, I'm actually reading a lot of crime fiction because I'm on the judging panel for the Crime Writers Association Gold Dagger this year. So
Mhm.
we've got about 200 novels to get through.
Oh my
So it's
God.
largely crime reading at the moment. But then a lot of that's quite horror-y. So it's not completely divorced. A lot of it's kind of serial killer horror stuff. And again, is really kind of similar field.
Yeah. So sorry, my cat's attacking my chair. He's never done that before. If anyone sees any weird twitching on my end, it's because my cat's attacking me. So try and professionally just ignore it. Um, yeah, I find all of those genres make great horror crossovers anyway. I've been seeing quite a rise in crime elements of horror fiction recently.
Yeah, and I think it's going both ways. I think there's a lot of crime elements in horror fiction, and there's a lot of horror elements in crime fiction as well. I think a lot of people have noticed that that horror's having kind of a bit of a moment at the moment. And certainly in cinema. I mean, horror cinema seems to have like half the stuff that's on in my local cinemas, horror films right now. And yeah, I think other people have kind of noticed that. So there were at least several of the books that I've read from the submissions to the Gold Dagger had kind of elements of horror just kind of threaded through the crime story, which I think they wouldn't have had like 5, 6 years ago. I think the landscape's changed a bit.
Yeah, I love that. It's my favorite thing to see is a nice little genre blend and crossovers of the genres. So, come sing for the harrowing. So I know that this particular copy will be out of print or is out of
Yes,
print.
pretty much now. Yeah, more or less.
Yeah.
I think there's one copy left on Amazon from what last time I looked, and that's about it. The
Grab it quick,
publisher's not
guys.
selling it anymore.
um, I'm so sorry. I can't remember if I've seen you post about this. Has somebody else picked this up yet?
Not yet, but I'm in discussions.
Yeah.
Everything got delayed a bit over Christmas and New Year, because it all kind of hit in sort of October, November. So because of that, things kind of slowed down. But I am in discussions with someone that would be good. So I'm kind of hopeful that it might happen.
Yes. Well, I feel like the world needs it because I don't. There are, I read some books, I get a lot of review requests, and then obviously my personal TBR pile as well. And sometimes I won't talk about books that I wasn't too fussed on, but if I love a book, I talk about it to death until I think that people might be sick of me mentioning it. And I don't know how many videos I've mentioned this in, or lists I put it in, written lists as well, and written reviews and stuff. But there was not a weak story in the entire thing, Dan. They were all really good, and I liked the folk horror, the folky ones, the best, I think. And some of them weren't quite folk horror, but they felt folk horror like to me.
That was yeah, that was a different thing for me as well. The folk horror thing. It's not something I've written a huge amount of before. And for whatever reason, I'm not sure where it came from, but I kind of just developed a bit of an interest in it a couple of years ago, and just kind of I was very much trying to kind of twist folk horror. I was kind of bored a bit with like very traditional folk horror, because I think we kind of all know that kind of template, the kind of Wicker Man template, and where it goes and how it works. And I
Yeah.
was like, well, what if we do other things with it? We don't have to do that. There's lots of other things you can do. What if you do other things with it?
Yeah.
And so I was just trying to mess with it a bit.
They were such creative takes, so they were, and a lot of the time I didn't know sort of which subgenre I was in until, you know, the last third or something, and I was like, oh my god, this is where it was going. So sorry, you'll have to forgive me, I'm terrible with titles. I can never remember titles of anything. But there is a story. It was the one about the pregnant lady. Can't
Oh,
remember.
yeah, the Wives of Tromile, the second.
Yes.
Yes.
I thought that was a really good example of something that wasn't, might not fit certain folk horror boxes, but that felt very folk horror like to me. But just I haven't seen a water law kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, and it was just trying to send it in different directions like that. And also, I mean, like you say, actually, it is something I very much try to do. I think because I do so much editing and so much kind of anthology editing as well, so I work with short stories a lot, that a lot of endings feel quite predictable to me just because I work with short stories so often. And so I very much try in my own ones to try and avoid that predictable ending. And so a lot of them do head off into kind of slightly different uncharted territory, sometimes even part way through. So you think you kind of know where it's heading. And then I try and send you off in a slightly different direction just because I've already got bored with that kind of cliched ending. By the time I'm halfway through writing it, I'm like, yeah, it's really obvious where this is going now. I'm kind of done with that already. And so I'll send it off somewhere else.
Yeah, the I love, so I'm really bad for this in film. I think it's because I took script writing, and part of that was like analysis and like how, so I feel like I spot setup. It ruined films for me for quite a while, those courses, but now I appreciate them in different ways instead. And I never, I feel like you set everything up so everything is, um, you know, you haven't just gone, oh, I'm just throwing something in as a surprise just for the sake of it. But also, I never worked anything out. So,
For a while I taught a short workshop on doing more or less exactly that. So basically it's kind of like seeing where your brain goes first, when you're kind of coming up with your story idea and plotting it out, seeing where your brain goes first, and then kind of saying, well, have I seen that before? Am I just thinking of that because I've seen that in half a dozen different films or read that in some books or whatever? And 9 times out of 10 that probably is the case. That's usually like the first place that your brain goes to, is that thing that you've seen over and over again, and it's kind of a well-trodden path. And then you kind of say, well, okay, let's not do that. Let's do something else. But it's still got to be something that makes sense.
yeah,
It can't
like,
just be like a surreal left turn that's completely different to the rest of the story. It's still got to make sense. And then it's finding that. And for me, that's the point then when I want to sit down and write it, is the point when I work out what that thing is that I can kind of
it's
do
so
for it.
it's so enjoyable because that's what gives books and stories like the rereadability for me. If it's something like that, and then I like to read it another time, a second time, to see if I'm like, oh, I can see some of it now, like where I wouldn't have noticed it before because the details didn't feel like plot details necessarily. Maybe they felt like character details or setting details or something, and then you're like, oh, that was actually.
Well, again, it's interesting. I mean, like, I obviously been so immersed in reading crime books at the moment. Obviously, that's a massive thing in crime fiction, is laying those kind of little clues along the way. And again, the ones that are really good and that work in the end are the ones where it all makes sense by the time you reach the end, but you can't see it on the way there. So it's kind of like all that stuff's buried in there somewhere, and you might have an inkling of where it's going to go, and then it goes somewhere different. But once it happens, you kind of go, oh yeah, of course, now that makes sense.
It's such a pleasure for me because I get a lot of book review requests for short story collections because apparently people find it hard to find reviewers
Yeah.
for collections for some, which I've also found myself when I've been trying to get people to read mine, and a lot of people take novels and nothing else. And I think last year I think I guesstimated I read somewhere between 500 and 600 short stories, like all across collections and anthologies and stuff. And I had to try really hard to just not put like 5 out of 10 in my top 10 from your book, just to so there's like a bit more variety for people with books. But I just it came in late as well because I read it in December, and I
Yeah, it
was
was
like,
very late. Yeah, yeah.
um, but yeah, I just loved it. With the with your experience editing anthologies, have you picked up lessons for yourself through being on that side of things that you use for your own short stories? Besides like wanting to surprise people a little bit more with endings, like have you noticed trends and stuff that you try to avoid?
I think I absolutely have. I mean, again, I think I've got used to seeing kind of which ones are really working and which ones aren't. And again, this is something I try to teach in workshops is yeah, I have a limited amount of time. I drop my kids off at school. I pick one of them up each day. You know, I have loads of other responsibilities as well. I also have my kind of work responsibilities. So my actual time for sitting down and doing my own writing is fairly small. So it's quite important, I think, for me and for a lot of people, to actually kind of work the story in my head beforehand, so that by the time I sit down to write, I'm not writing something that's going to be rubbish that I have to screw up and throw away at the end of the day. That I've actually done kind of like all that sorting and editing in my head in advance, so that by the time I sit down, I know what I want to do with it, and I know what I've got is kind of solid and good. And I've got much better at doing that just by seeing, like, when you get submissions in for anthologies, you whether it's open submissions or if they're invited submissions, in fact, is that you get some and you kind of go, huh, yeah, that was okay. That was a good kind of like middle of the road, straightforward story, but nicely told normally, or whatever. But then you get ones that just blow your mind, and you're just like, oh my God, yeah, that's an amazing story.
Yeah.
And whenever that happens, I do tend to pick that apart. I'll pick that apart and kind of go, well, why is that amazing? What am I loving about that? And quite often it's that it surprises me, or that it tells it in such a way that it has a unique voice or whatever. It's just so, you know, there's various ways of doing it. But yeah, I do that a lot. I've also just got better at getting into a headspace, I think, where I'm editing, and I can do that for my own work as well now as for other people's. I mean, I still miss things because everybody does, but I've got much better at. It's almost just like a little filter. It's almost like being able to treat it like it's somebody else's piece of work and seeing all the flaws.
Yeah, the I being on the editing side of anthologies, it has taught I've been on the editing side twice, and it has taught me to never be offended if my story doesn't make it into an anthology ever again, because now I know. And if it's a themed anthology, try not like I recently worked on a werewolf anthology, and we had loads of really great submissions, but they were building up to it was a surprise that it was a werewolf, and I was like, but it's a werewolf themed anthology. Like the story would be like really good, and if it was for a general horror anthology, it would work really well.
Yes.
But everyone who's going to pick up the book knows that this is
This,
werewolf.
this is again, this is one of the pieces of advice I gave on the workshop, was that yeah, you've got to bear in mind. I mean, like most people, if you look at the Mark Morris's anthologies that he's doing for Flame Tree at the moment, he's getting like 800 plus submissions for 4 open spots. So there's 4 open spots, 800 plus submissions, and it's just absolutely insane. I mean, I got into one of them, so it's possible, but just the odds are hugely stacked against you. And I would guarantee if those like 800 odd stories, if it was werewolf themed, yeah, like 700 of those 800, maybe even 750 would be along those lines. And you've got to make yourself stand out. You've got to say, well, okay, I think everyone else is going to be doing this kind of story. Well, what can I do that's a bit different? I got a really nice piece of advice. Well, I remember actually, one of the best bits of advice I ever got in terms of structuring short stories was from Paul Tremblay, and it was when he was the guest at FantasyCon, and we were just chatting in the bar, and I literally cannot even remember how he phrased it or how it came up, but it was to do with the fact that the thing that quite often people write short stories and then they kind of want to have the little twist at the end. So it's the twist, like the twist, oh yeah, and he turns into a werewolf. That quite often, not always, but quite often, that isn't the end of the story. It's actually kind of the middle of the story. And then your second half of the story is how that affects everyone and how that affects everything that happened afterwards. And just viewing it in those terms made a huge difference to me. There's a couple of stories in that collection which literally that happened. I'd written a story and I was like, okay, I'm done. And then I looked at it again and I was like, no, that's not. That's kind of like the midpoint, maybe 2/3 of the way through. Well, we need to see what happened after that. We need to see where that goes next.
Yeah, it's so hard, isn't it? If you're submitting something and you know there are going to be hundreds, if not over 1,000 submissions. I know Flame Tree just did one, and I think they said they had 1,400
Yeah,
submissions.
yeah.
Oh my God. I submitted something recently where I felt like I had a really unique take on the theme, but I wanted to save like what my take was until the end, and I thought they're going to have hundreds of submissions, and if I don't get to it faster, they're not even going to get to that page because they're going to be like, well, this is fine. So, yeah.
The awful thing is as well, I mean, I say this to people over and over again, is that I think when I started out, I assumed that, you know, I would still be okay even if there were lots of submissions with things, because a lot of it would be rubbish, and it's not. A lot of it's perfectly fine. A lot of it's really well written. That's the awful thing. It's like, and so you genuinely need to stand out for some reason, because just being kind of pretty good and well written is not enough.
Yeah. It's in fact, that's not even the most important thing sometimes, because you end up having to reject loads of really well written stories just because I had to reject quite a lot because they were similar to one from an invited author.
Yes.
There's nothing wrong with a story like perfectly deserving of a place, but you just don't have room for all 300 as it was in my case. So
yeah, that's literally happened to me in the past. I have been dropped from an anthology because one of the invited authors handed theirs in late, and it was almost identical to mine in terms of the story and the theme, and so they very politely dropped mine.
I know I had to. There was a story I really liked, but I also had a story in this anthology that I was editing, and the title, it wasn't actually a similar concept really, but the title was identical, and I was like, oh no, am I going to reject someone that's written something similar to me, and then they're going to think they stole my idea?
Well, I'll tell you what. So one of the pieces of advice I gave on the workshop was that especially with themed anthologies, and if you're working to a theme, it's to, first of all, I prefer to work with multiple things in a story. So if I have an idea for a story, I then like to take another idea, or maybe like something I'm slightly obsessed with, or a period I want to set something in, or a style of story, like a you know, telling it through letters or through a film script or whatever. And then mix all of those up. So we have several of those going on at once. We have my original story idea, but maybe in an unusual setting or in a different time period, and then something else I'm obsessed about be kind of involved in it as well. So I'm kind of pulling from several directions at once. And I was kind of saying to people that I feel like that's a really fertile ground for making yourself stand out from the submissions pile. Because I think as soon as you start following things that are kind of personal obsessions, so not things you've necessarily just seen someone do somewhere else or that you like in other horror writers or whatever, but just things you're just like weirdly obsessed with that your brain's just kind of got snagged on for no particular reason, that's really personal to you. And so it does two things. It makes it very original because it's personal to you, but also I think the writing is almost always better because you are personally invested in it and personally interested in it. There's like the story that's in the collection that's set it's the one that's told through a series of tapes of recorded interviews with the members of the band that's set during like grunge era Seattle. I was just obsessed with grunge era Seattle for a while, and I made a massive playlist that ran for like 100 hours or something insane of just like really kind of obscure like early grunge music and stuff, and listened to a bunch of that and talked to a friend who was out there at the time and knew some of the people involved to get a bit of feedback from him, and just kind of put all of those elements in and then put it together with wanting to do a very fragmented story that was told through these recordings, which is another separate idea I'd had, and then also jammed it together with another couple of ideas. I actually did a cut-up technique on that one as well, where so I wrote out each transcript of each character's interview just from beginning to end. I did one character at a time, just wrote them all up, and then basically cut all those up and tried moving them around into different orders and different sequences. Wrote some song lyrics and dropped those in as well, and just kind of messed around with it until I was kind of happy with it.
Yeah, it was. I love that story, by the way. I'm going to say that on every story because I really do. There's nothing I love more than sort of like variety in how a story is told in a collection or an anthology.
That was one of the things I wanted to do. That was one of the reasons why I did it, is because I'm very aware there's a certain type of story that I tend to lean towards. So I was like, well, let's do something different. Let's have a different one that kind of mixes things up a little bit.
Do you have a favorite sort of format to read? Like if you see something that's in like diary form or something, do you have a favorite, or is it all?
I don't particularly. I'm not a massive fan of first person at the moment, I have to say. I've struggled with a few first person books this year. I think first person books are really good if they've got a really unique voice and there's a reason for it to be in the first person. But I think for a lot of people, I don't want to say it's laziness, but it can kind of feel a bit like laziness. You're just basically they're just imagining they're that character and then just splurging whatever comes into the head out onto the page. Yeah, so I've had a bit of an issue with that recently. So I'm not a big fan of that. I think in terms of favourites, I probably lean towards just standard like third person. Third person quite focused though. So third person kind of focused in on one character. I don't like these very omniscient ones that jump around a lot.
Yeah, I like third person, but if the prose is sort of like in the voice of the protagonist.
Yeah.
So that's always really interesting. I've struggled a little bit with first person this year. I've read some really great ones, but I've had a lot that have been sent to me where it's first person, but for some reason the narrator just talks like it's in the third, like the language is like third person prose, and I'm like,
yeah,
people don't talk like that. If you can do it,
it's really weird. And I have a real problem with first person ones where they seem to have like 100% like self knowledge and kind of insight into what they're doing and what their motivations are. And I'm like, nobody really understands what their own motivations are.
That's yeah. I enjoy a first person flawed protagonist that doesn't seem very aware that they're a dick. That's probably my favorite.
Yeah, that kind of thing. I mean, I'm absolutely up for that every time. But I mean, the other thing that I've had a problem with, there was one in particular, and I forget even what the book was called, so I can't name it, which is probably a good thing. But it had 3 different protagonists, all in the first person, and they all basically had the same voice. I was finding it enormously difficult to tell who was who and what was what, and I was like, I mean, why? I'm pretty sure all 3 of them just had the author's voice, to be honest, was the conclusion I came to.
Yeah, if you're going to do that, you need to not give the reader extra work in like having to turn back and go like, hang on, who are we following?
Yeah, it made it really confusing, and it made it just feel really unrealistic because they didn't feel like actual people. They just felt like, you know, all filters for this one author, rather than actually being a person. Yeah. So I've had, like I said, real issues with that. But otherwise, I'm up for most things. I quite like things that are kind of weird structurally and all that kind of stuff. Some of my favorite books do kind of weird things with structure and things. In fact, John Langan's The Fisherman would be a fine example of that. Kind of stories nested inside stories and stuff. I'm always up for that.
I was going to ask if you've read House of Leaves and what your thoughts were if you have.
Do you know what I have? But it was a long time ago. I'm not entirely sure when, but it was pretty close to when it came out. So I used to work in a bookshop. I was a bookshop manager for a couple of years. And so for that period, if things came out during that period, I read them generally either just before they came out or just after they came out. So it was a long time ago. I mean, I liked it. I also read, he had a book afterwards. I can't remember what it was called. Something to do with the sword, I think. I quite like that one as well. And I always like that kind of experiment. I'm always up for that. I always feel it's very bold. It can also fail enormously. I had a guy who always used to send submissions when I had open submissions going on. And they had like weird fonts and text all over the place and like giant bits of text and like single letters on a page and all this kind of stuff. And it was just terrible. So it's like when it fails quite spectacularly. But if you can pull it off, it can be really good.
I think House of Leaves pulled it off, but there are 2 camps of people with House of Leaves. There's the camp that like, I hate it and it's pretentious crap. And then there were people like me who like, well, I initially struggled with it a little bit, but then when I started to get really into it, I was like, this is scary.
But see, unfortunately, I'm both kind of in both camps, and I think it is pretentious crap, but it's also pretentious crap that I quite enjoy. I quite like pretentious crap sometimes. I mean, who doesn't?
I was a little confused, and I'm sure that I missed loads of because I know there are loads of like hidden things in there, and I probably missed loads of them, but I had a fun time with it anyway. In terms of, so let's have a little talk about Heartwood.
Oh yes.
So would you like to tell people a little bit about this, because I picked this up at the launch at FantasyCon, and I don't think launches always get me. That's where I spend all my money. I get really excited. I buy everything. And I didn't remember as I was walking off what you actually said the concept of this was until I sat down with it again. And I was like, oh, cool. So yeah, would you like to tell people a little bit?
So that was a massive labour of love, really. It was actually more or less 2 years in the making from when I first kind of came up with the idea to when we actually came out with it. But basically, again, it was. I think I said this at the launch. I'd reached a point where I basically said I wasn't going to do an anthology again. I was like, I'm done. I'm not going to do an anthology. It's so much work. No one ever thanks you.
Yeah.
It's like, it'll maybe reach 100 people if you're really lucky. So I was like, I'm just not doing another one. And then I just had this little inkling of idea that if I did one, the one I'd really want to do was I loved Robert Holdstock's book Mythago Wood when I was a kid. Was that kid, teenager? And I'd read like a bunch of other stuff at the time as well, but it was kind of the one that stayed with me. So as I grew older, I was kind of like, I had conversations with people at conventions and stuff, and kind of said, "Oh yeah, that's an amazing book, wasn't it?" And just the ideas of it and the way it kind of mixes kind of fantasy and folk horror and kind of other elements was really interesting. And then I happened to notice that it was coming up for 40 years since it had come out, and I was like, wouldn't it be really cool if we did anthology of brand new Mythago Wood stories? Because Rob Holdstock died relatively young, having caught a very sudden illness. It was a very quick illness, and he died like very suddenly and unexpectedly. And I mean, he was a huge figure on the scene. Mythago Wood won the World Fantasy Award and the British Fantasy Award, but I mean, he also had a whole slew of other books under his belt, and a lot of other people have kind of other favourites either in that series or in a different series. So I kind of thought it would be a cool idea, and I thought, I kind of said to myself, you know what? I'm just going to go and ask a couple of people who might be interested in writing something for it, and they'll probably say no, and then that'll be the end of it, and I can just go, oh yeah, it wouldn't work, whatever. And I can't even remember who it was I reached out to first, but I kept reaching out to people, and everyone just said, oh yeah, that'd be amazing, I'd love to do that. Some people because they knew Rob, and so they kind of wanted to do it as a tribute to him, and some because they just loved the book and they read the book and they wanted to do something, that it kind of expressed their love of the book and their enjoyment of it. And I think for a few of them as well, they're very, very much in a position like me that actually, their teenage self would have been absolutely over the moon at the thought of that they could have done something to do anything to do with Mythago Wood. So the fact that we were being allowed to kind of play with it, and there were lots of stumbling points. There was like the point where I approached his heir, Sarah, who she could easily have said no. But I got in touch with it. It was actually through the agency that's dealing with the rights at first, and they passed it on to her. And I assumed it was just going to be a no. We don't want you to do that with his world. Thank you very much. And I'd almost forgotten about it. And it's about 5 or 6 weeks later, I just suddenly got an email back from Howard, the agent who deals with it, just saying, "Oh yeah, I spoke to Sarah, and she'd love for you to do this."
Yeah,
I was like, "Oh my god, it's actually happening!"
It's it actually feels like it's put together by people who love it, and so that's a completely alien story to me. I didn't know it. I didn't know the author, and I thought, oh, am I going to have to read that first? And then I thought, no, I'm just going in. And now I'm rereading it to review it because usually I'm sat there making notes with every book I read, but I wanted to just sit and relax with a book over Christmas, and that was something that came through with all of it. Was just like the sort of like fandom feel, and it felt wholesome.
Yes.
Because of that.
And it feels like, I don't think you often get to feel it in terms of like books and publishing, but it felt like we'd done something that was actually kind of worthwhile. It wasn't just like a fun read, but actually had a point to it beyond just like being a fun read, which was really nice. And the fact that we've been able to like bring his work back to people's attention again that maybe had forgotten about it or hadn't read it first time round is also just like an added bonus as well, really. I did hear a rumor, I don't know if it's true, that there's going to be a Follow Society edition of Mythago Wood coming in the works somewhere. So, that might happen at some point. And it's just kind of like, it just feels nice to be able to bring that to more people again. And in all honesty, actually, as well, it was an absolute pleasure being able to revisit it all like as part of my job. Because I sat down and read all of his Mythago Wood books again. I made in the back of the book, there's a big glossary of all the terms because I made that as I worked through them all. Just as a kind of aid memoir for when I came to editing and stuff. But then I thought, well, we'll stick it in the book since I've made it. But yeah, just kind of immersing myself in his world for a few months as part of the editing process was itself really good fun. And I'm really glad I did it.
It's so cool when for work or a project you just get to do something so enjoyable. Have you always worked in bookish sectors?
More or less. I mean, I did an English degree at university, and then went to work in a bookshop, and then became a bookshop manager, Then for a while I kind of drifted a bit. I was like a freelance music journalist very briefly, but like at the worst possible time to be a freelance music journalist, when it was all dropping out of magazines and becoming like free online stuff. So I got a little bit of like paid work for magazines, but pretty soon everyone was like, "Oh no, we're not paying freelancers anymore." It's like, "Oh, okay."
Dang
I
it.
got lots of free concerts for a while, so that was quite nice. For a period of about 3 or 4 years, I went to a load of really good kind of free concerts and things. And then yeah, since that I've kind of done proofreading and editing, and it's quite nice. I kind of feel like even when I can't find time to sit down and do my own writing, because I'm kind of actually in that phase at the moment. I've not really got time at the moment because I have a lot of jobs on at the moment. But even when I've got that, I'm still working in books, so I kind of feel like I'm still getting better at editing and spotting what's good and what isn't, and what works for me and what doesn't. And I kind of like it's nice because it means I don't ever completely put it aside. I'm still always kind of involved in it.
Yeah. It's all transferable skills and stuff as well. I think I studied script writing because I didn't want to do English, because when I was looking at the reading lists and stuff, I was like, oh, this isn't really what I want to study. So I did script writing instead, and it was during that so I did theatre first, and then I did a master's in script writing, and it was during the master's year that I started actually getting accepted into anthologies and stuff, because I guess maybe my short story writing improved because I was learning about like everything else.
I'm sure it would have. I'm sure, absolutely sure it would have. I mean, I kind of feel like this is one of the reasons why I think that there is some famous quote that I can never remember who it's from, or or even what the quote itself is, but about how it's something like, oh, I can't remember now. But then the key essence of it is that, you know, anyone under the age of about 40 really has all the drive and the enthusiasm to write a story, but it's only once you kind of turn 40 that maybe you have all the experience to be able to do it. And I don't feel it's necessarily true, but I do think that getting experience in other fields kind of surrounding it, and even just life experience, only ever enriches what you're writing. So I kind of feel like the more you can experience that world, whether it's script writing or editing, or even just being I was a slush reader for I can't even remember what the publication was called. It was when I lived in America briefly. There was a publication over there that I used to do slush reading for, and even just doing that, you just get a sense of, again, which stories work, which ones don't, the kind of things that editors are seeing over and over again that maybe, you know, maybe that means you avoid it. And just getting that whole sense, it all feeds into it. I used to say to people on my courses that there's this advice about how you should write every day, and I know there are some very nice people out there, including Mark Morris, who's still big proponents of that, but it's just not possible for everyone. For some people it is, and if you can, that's brilliant, and you absolutely should. But if you can't, because you're busy doing other things, that's fine, but you can still be a writer every day, even if you're not writing, because you can be thinking about writing, you can be reading books, you can be thinking about a story and working it through in your head and doing all that stuff. Being a writer doesn't have to be sitting down, putting words on the page all the time. And in fact, I'd suggest it isn't that all the time. If that's all you're doing, you're probably missing something.
Yeah, I actually the last author interview I did with Gavin Dillinger, he said a similar thing, and that we shouldn't really be beating ourselves up the way we do if we can't write every day. And we're all looking up to our favorite full-time writers who don't
Yes,
have other day
absolutely.
jobs. And yeah, and they have you know, more time, and a lot of, you know, everyone always looks at Stephen King, if you're in horror, about his writing routine. It's like, yes, but his children have grown up and left the house, so he doesn't have that going on. And I mean, I do think he is some sort of wizard for how he managed to get himself going initially, because, you know, he would have had a lot going on then. But currently, nobody really realistically can do
Well,
that.
also, I mean, you know, he's in a position where he gets to say yes and no to whoever he wants to as well. So he only does the things he wants to do. Whereas when you're kind of earlier on in a career, then it's not always an option to say no to good opportunities. You kind of feel, actually, no, I do have to say yes to that, because I probably won't get offered it again. So
I yeah, I'm looking forward to. I'm hoping you're going to do more anthologies, because
yeah, I hope so.
I've come to read. Mark Morris is someone I've also talked about a lot recently in terms of editing, because when I review anthologies, I tend to neglect to mention the editor, when actually, if the editor, like, I know, I started realizing that the really good anthologies that I really enjoyed were put together by really, like, there's a direct correlation between good editor, good anthology, I think. And I I think one of the best things that people who are submitting to anthologies can do is read a lot of anthologies to see what's, because I noticed when I do that, which kinds of subgenres are very in vogue all of a sudden, because you'll get, there was a year where everything all of a sudden was vampires. Well, that was a few years actually, but there are trends.
We might get that again with Nosferatu at the moment as well. I suspect we're going to get a year of vampire stories.
Yeah. Yeah, I see on a lot of submission calls, no vampires, werewolves, or zombies. That's usually ruled out. I think vampires are always just looping background, though, aren't they? They never really go.
Yeah, and you can kind of do similar things and just not call it a vampire. You know, there are ways around it if you desperately want to, and you have a story you want to tell. But it is just, I mean, you do just see the same things over and over again. And also the other interesting thing reading like good anthologies and reading a lot of good anthologies is seeing how much the editors do like to have that variety in there. So again, it just makes that point again of just not telling the story that 80% of the other people are going to be trying to tell, because you're just really reducing your chances down to like a bare minimum of actually getting in. Whereas if you can do something that's a bit different and unique, then I just, you know, it still has to be good, but you want to take kind of every chance you can to kind of up your odds. And I think that's a good way to do it personally.
Also, if you read a lot of those, you start noticing the turns of phrase that people use over and over. Like everyone says certain things, and I will never again write that someone had a lump in their throat the size of an orange, for example, because I'd seen it so much. I didn't realize that's like a phrase that everyone's heard, but I just didn't realize how many people use it as a descriptor. So that's a lesson I've taken from
the one that always gets me is when characters say something through gritted teeth. You get a lot of people saying things through gritted teeth, and it's like you can't even speak through gritted teeth. It's like this. It doesn't even mean anything really, and yet we get it a lot. And sometimes people overuse it as well. So even within one story, they'll have multiple characters saying things through gritted teeth, and it's like, I don't think people do that.
Yeah, it's only when you're reading it over and over that it occurs to you. So I'm not making fun of anyone that uses these phrases, because I've used them all myself. It's like when you're reading short after short after short, and you're like, well, I've seen that every single time. And someone turning on their heel is another one that I really enjoy, because if I imagine someone actually turning, if you tried to turn on your heel, you'll probably go down.
Do you know what though? That again, all of that I think it's kind of for me as an editor, it's a sign that it's too early a draft, because normally if something's been edited like properly by the author, normally or by anyone else, but usually by the author, normally you can edit that stuff out, because like first draft, quite often that stuff will just splurge, and you'll have phrases that you personally like to use, and because you're kind of just writing quickly and writing the story as it comes to you, that stuff comes out on the page. It always does, and it always will. But there needs to be a stage in the editing when you go back and say, oh yeah, it's a 10-page story and I've had 4 people grit their teeth. Maybe I need to cut this down a little bit.
Yeah, there are extremes, aren't there, on the editing scale? Because I talked to Adam Neville before, and he said that by the time a book actually comes out, he's redrafted it like 8 times, and he's probably rewritten every single sentence a couple of times over. And I'm like, wow, like that seems excessive, but it definitely works for him, because I think his books are wonderful.
The most extreme one that I know of is Matt Hill, who wrote Lamb, that came out about a year ago now, I think, or just over a year. And I did a couple of events with Matt, and I know him fairly well anyway, and I worked as the editor on the book as well. And it turns out that actually there was a point where he basically scrapped the entire manuscript and just rewrote it from the beginning and from memory. So he basically wrote out an entire story, novel length, and then scrapped it and rewrote it from memory again. And it was a technique. I can't remember who he said told it to him. It might have been Christopher Priest, or it might be Nina Allen. But yeah, somebody had mentioned to him like this as a technique for kind of like polishing the prose and getting back to the kind of the essence of the story. So you kind of lose a lot of the irrelevant peripheral stuff. And it's a way of getting yourself to just focus on what the actual core essential elements of the story are. But I'm like, yeah, I'd love the time to do that. But I mean, you know, I'd only write like one story every 2 or 3 years if I tried to do that.
Yeah, you have to have sort of a realistic time frame where you go, right, that's enough redrafting now. I like have to have to send the thing off, or it's just gonna float in the ether forever.
I mean, it's funny as well. Different people work differently. I do know some people who write a lot. So they write pretty much every day, if not every day, and then they also submit a lot of stuff to a lot of magazines. But a lot of it doesn't hit. So a lot of it ends up either not being published or being published somewhere fairly minor and not really being seen by many people. Whereas I'm like the other end of the spectrum, where I don't write very much. I really write. It's probably a good year if I've written about 5 or 6 stories, to be honest. But pretty much all of them will land at some point because I work them all pretty hard. So I don't just kind of write them and move on to the next one. It's like I'll sit there and edit and rewrite and rethink and maybe jig things around and cut bits out and rewrite the ending. And I think there's a lot of space in between. I think most people probably sit somewhere in the middle on the scale. But I think it's about finding what works for you as well sometimes. It's kind of like, I think some people want to write lots. Some people want to just get there and be able to sit at the laptop or the whatever, the notebook, and just, just splurge out story after story after story. And some of them work and some of them don't. And some people want to kind of sit and fine tune things. Most extreme example I ever knew, the American writer who I was friends with when I was over there. He's had a few novels out. And he was full-time writer. I mean, even when he was full-time writing, he had a good day writing if he wrote 300 words.
Yeah.
But then he basically didn't edit. Those 300 words were essentially just like perfect and done. Yeah.
It's nuts. Sometimes I'll have like a completely free day and I'm like, oh, I bet I can fill up I'm like 10k words to go on this, and I bet I could do it in this day. But it's not just time, it's like it's mental energy as well.
Yes.
Because a few thousand words in, or like a couple of hours in, I'm burned out, and if I carry on, it's just going to be like half-hearted nonsense. Like it's just not going to
be. Somebody told me once that about they had a limit of about 2,000 words. And I've heard that a few times, that around about 2,000 is a good limit for the day. But then recently I've had a couple of occasions where I've just sat and written, one of being the Macmillan sponsored write that Rachel Knightley runs, and I've just written like 4,000 in a day and been pretty happy with them, to be honest. They weren't necessarily perfect and they needed a bit of editing and stuff, but I think it was a 4,000 word story.
Yeah, you have peaks and troughs. Like if I'm writing a short story for something and I'm really excited, like the idea is already fully formed in my head, I'll sit down and write that in like one sitting, and then I'll leave it a day and go back and edit, draft, whatever. But if the longer fiction, I've been working on a novel forever, and I'm always like, oh right, these are the months I'm giving myself, and I can never. I can't.
I've tried doing that. I could never do it either. The only solution I've come up with is to trick myself into thinking that it's a lot of short stories.
Well, maybe I'll try it.
So I'm like, okay, well, the next scene or whatever that I'm doing is this. So that's a short story that I'm just going to tell. I'm just going to tell this. I'm not worrying about the next bit or what comes after that or where it's heading. I'm just going to tell this.
Yeah.
And then once I've done that, it's like, okay, now the only problem is that occasionally then I fall in a gap in the middle. If I haven't thought sufficiently about what the next bit is, then I suddenly I reach the end of the bit I was doing and I'll be like, oh, okay, I've kind of fallen off a cliff now.
Yeah. There's I'm finding longer fiction quite hard compared, because I find short stories like so enjoyable to write, and by comparison they're much easier obviously than writing a novel. I hit 40k in a novel, and every time I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing.
You know what? That's not that unusual either. Around that period, I don't think. Around sort of like 30,000-40,000.
Yeah.
It's quite common. It's enough that you feel like you should know as well. You're kind of like, it's not like I'm just starting out. It's like I've got a good way into this, and now it's just it's like your head kind of can't hold on to it for long enough.
Yeah.
I find I'm very I get interested in lots of different things. And because of that, if I'm not careful, my attention kind of swerves off in a different direction from where it started.
I'm excited to get to my like final scenes because I've known what they are for the whole time. So I know, like the middle bit, I'm a bit like, I just want to get.
Do you know, I've been very intrigued recently to read a few things with Jeff Vandermeer in particular, talking about writing things out of sequence. How if a scene occurs to him and it's a really strong scene, even if it's at the end of the book, he'll just sit down and write it. And then when he gets to the end, he'll worry about compiling them all together and putting it into a narrative. I was like, wow, it never even occurred to me you could do that.
Yeah,
Because as a reader, you only ever read beginning to end. So that's like, for most of us, that's the experience of the story. But this idea of like, okay, well, that end scene's really strong in my mind. So just sit down and write that end scene and then come back and fill in the gaps and write the other bits. And
yeah, it's not a bad idea. I have written a few sort of stray scenes as they recur to me, and some of them are in, and some of them I'll never. They will work now as I've carried on. But I talked to Tim Levin about that middle of the road bit, and I was like, I just feel like I'm never going to get this debut novel done ever, because I did write one, but it turned out to be trash. I can't publish it, so that was a practice one. And he was just like, yeah, we're all like that with the middle of a novel game. You've just gotta finish it.
Yeah, that's the thing is that I think a lot of us assume that once you're kind of like a professional writer with lots of experience and lots of novels under your belt, that goes away. But I don't think it does. I think it's still there. It's just you're used to it, and it's kind of like an old friend. You're like, oh, it's that bit again, where I feel like it's all gone to pot and I can't make it work. That's all right. I've dealt with this before. We'll just move on.
There's nothing more encouraging and refreshing than talking to a full-time, like, successful writer, and they're just like, I never know what I'm doing. I just start typing and hope for the best. I'm like, oh, okay.
I mean, I'm a massive fan of editing, as you would probably imagine, being an editor. And I think most things are fixable in an edit as well. And I think too many of us are too critical on first draft. I've been trying to teach myself to be less critical on first draft, but more critical on later drafts.
Yeah, you'll never finish it.
First draft, just get it out. It doesn't matter if it doesn't make sense. It doesn't matter if there are glaring holes. That's all fixable. Just get it out and get to the end of the story, and then go back and do the fixing. The other thing I've learned at the other end of it is that kind of little nagging feeling you have sometimes that something's not quite right here, but we can probably get away with it. You can't get away with it.
Yeah.
You should absolutely listen to that voice and go back and fix that. Because it's very easy to kind of convince yourself, like, I'm not 100% happy with that bit, but it'll be okay. And it's like, no, if you've noticed it and you are the person who loves the story most and are closest to it, I can guarantee other people will spot it. So it's like, yeah, listen to that voice every time towards the end, but at the beginning, don't overthink it. It's almost like a different mindset. You have to kind of put a different hat on and just kind of go, okay, I'm just going to splurge this opening draft. I do have a novel manuscript which I was trying to shop around. It was, again, I wrote it really piecemeal over a long period of time, and it wasn't ideal. I mean, maybe it was ideal for me, I don't know, because I tend to work better short form anyway. So maybe it was ideal for me to be able to do that, but it fell over COVID and stuff partly as well, and so I got really interrupted with that. But I did finish it, and I sent it around a load of agents and things, and got really positive responses, but all no's at the end of the day. So I got lots of agents asking to see full manuscript. I got lots of really positive feedback, but nobody really wanted it or knew what to deal with it. It was about 75,000 words at that point. Just recently, I've gone back to it, and I've cut it down to 50,000 and completely rewritten the ending, because I decided I just wasn't happy with the way I'd ended it. I tried to tack on like a commercial ending to the end of it, and it really just wasn't where it wanted to go. And it's looking better. I'm like, maybe it wasn't wasted time after all. I'm going to try submitting it some places. We'll see if anyone wants it. But it was an interesting exercise, cutting down from 75,000 to 50, so kind of literally about a third of the text out. Really kind of stripped it back to what the story really was. I guess, like we were saying earlier about like doing that kind of rewriting the manuscript technique, it just makes you see, okay, well, is this bit actually essential? No, then it goes.
Yeah, I think that being able to condense effectively does make your story stronger if you can tell it in like, it's such a weird thing to say, but if you can tell your story in as few words as possible, it's probably going to be stronger. That was something I learned on my script writing course about writing pitches, because pitches just can't be long if you're talking script or anything for the screen, especially. And I found it really hard. I was like, hang on, my tutor said, if you can't condense the overall story into a pitch, then it's too convoluted and everything. And that was what taught me how to approach flash fiction, because the first couple of pieces I had published were flash fiction pieces, and it was around the time that I was trying to stick to 100 words or less or whatever, and it's really hard, but I think it helped me in the long run with other work then, because I tend to, I'm like, oh, I don't need both of those words, or there's a more condensed way of saying that rather than, you know.
And again, for me, a lot of that comes out in the edit, because quite a lot often I'll read a sentence that I've written, and yeah, like I can just chop whole chunks of it out because they're just not necessary. You kind of find your brain finds, I think when we talk in conversation, we quite often find very long-winded ways of expressing things, but when it's on the page, that soon becomes very obvious,
Yeah.
and it kind of slows the whole process down. So it's just learning to cut those things out. But again, they are kind of different for everyone. It's something you notice editing anthologies, actually, is like every story you come to, the editing job is different.
Mm-hmm.
So whereas if you're working on a novel, the job will be fairly consistent all the way through normally. With short stories in an anthology, by different authors, you get different things need doing to everyone. So sometimes the story will be really solid, but they're just like, sometimes it's just like really basic formatting issues and things. You just need to
Yeah.
kind of like make the punctuation right and things like that. Other times they have like weird narrative quirks that you kind of need to tame down a bit, or
Mm-hmm.
it's just different with every story. And I think that's it. I think it's finding like what your problems are, what your
Yeah.
little kind of like bumps in the road are, and trying to smooth over it as much as possible.
What is it about the editing process that you enjoy so much?
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, the fact that I appear to be able to do it kind of helps, because I find it relatively easy, and I think I'm a fairly hands-off editor as well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really like making massive changes. My preference is always to let things stand as they are as much as possible,
Mm-hmm.
because I think otherwise you're just trying to imprint your own style and your own voice on it, whereas
Mm-hmm.
really you just want to help the author make their voice the best it can be, rather than trying to imprint your own kind of expectations and things on it. So I'm fairly hands off, but it, it's a nice way of being involved in writing and in books
Mm-hmm.
without having to do all the writing yourself. But also feeling like you can be helping other people out. I mean, the number of authors where I've done some kind of edit or whatever on their book, and they've got in touch with me afterwards. So quite often my contact will be from the publisher, so I'll be sent it by the publisher saying we need a whatever copy edit or structural edit or whatever on this. But the number of authors that after that's all done, I'll get a message from them on one of the social medias, sort of kind of saying, oh, I see that you did the copy edit. Oh, thanks so much. I'm so happy with it, and it looks much better now. Blah blah blah. And it's the fact that you feel like, okay, I actually helped that person and helped make that book a bit better. And
Yeah, so it's so much fun just to get to do something like if you're already a reader, it's really fun to, get paid to do something like
yeah,
that. I edited a book recently that isn't out yet, and I was so excited as soon as I started it. The first few pages, I was like, "Oh, this is going to be good." I could tell that the story was great, and then it was mostly just like fixing typos or just suggesting maybe a little bit of a restructure on a paragraph or something like that. But I always feel satisfied if you catch just like a silly little error because you're reading it faster than they wrote it, so you'll remember something that was said a
yeah,
few
yeah, yeah.
chapters ago. And I'm like, oh, goody. And that's what I need with my stuff because I tend to repeat words a lot when I'm typing. And I don't even notice it when I read my own stuff back. So I need somebody else to go, how many times are you going to write the word realize on one page?
There's one of my favorites of all time, and he won't mind me saying this because we've discussed it multiple times in the past. But Matt Hill, again, who I mentioned earlier, so his first two books were out with Titan, and I did copy edits on those for Titan. And I forget which one of the two it was, but in one of them, there was a passage where he said that the main character went back to their sleeping place. And I just put a note on it saying, by sleeping place, did you mean bed? And he was like, yeah, I absolutely totally meant bed. I don't know why the word bed didn't come into my head, but for some reason I wrote sleeping place. And it's that kind of stuff. It's like,
Yeah.
it just for whatever reason, his brain had just gone to the word sleeping place. And I was like, sleeping place? There was another one actually where someone had mentioned that it was a cellar that was filled with jars of pickles, and they were pickled like onions and cucumbers and walnuts and strawberries. And I was like, pretty sure you can't pickle strawberries. I've never seen a pickled strawberry. That's right. I googled it and I was like, yeah, that doesn't seem to be a thing. Nobody pickles strawberries. And again, it was just like, for whatever reason, their brain had kind of they'd put that out just as, the way that it was telling the story. But when we actually looked at it, they were like, oh yeah, you don't pickle strawberries. What was I thinking?
Yeah, I think we all do it when we're writing though, because you're thinking about quite a lot as you're going along. So those kinds of like sillinesses find their way in. Sometimes I read something that I've written a couple of days later and I hit a sentence or a paragraph and I'm like, huh? What? What did I mean? What is this?
One of
Yeah.
my favourites as well was when I was editing The Willow by Your Side for it's Peter Haynes's book that we brought out with Unsung Stories. And again, he won't mind me saying this because we talk about it a lot. But there was a passage in there where it was kind of set in the 1940s, I think, if I remember correctly. And the passage there where someone was walking like back on this like side road to their place in like I can't remember where, like the Devon or somewhere, I think. And he talked about them walking along the tarmac, and I was like, do you know what? I'm not sure if minor roads would have been tarmacked in the 1940s. And so I spent about half an hour online trying to find information about when, like, not just when main arterial routes in Britain were tarmacked over, but when like the minor side roads and things were tarmacked over. And it turns out it wouldn't have been. It wouldn't have been tarmacked for quite a while. So
It's
and it's just like stupid stuff like that. It was like, wow. I mean, you kind of feel like, okay, most authors are just going to read, most readers are just going to read that and not even notice. But even if it ruins the story for one person, because they come across that kind of little inconsistency, that's one person who's not going to enjoy the book. So if you can just fix all those little things and plug all those little holes, it just makes the whole book so much more enjoyable.
Yeah, it's just like fine tuning. I'm terrible for that if I watch anything on TV or a film. If there's an inaccuracy that comes up and I'm like, oh, I've never watched a medical drama before, and I gave House a whirl this week. And the first thing I saw in the first episode, I was like, why are all of the consultants doing the lab work? Doctors don't do the lab work, and I know that for a fact because my cousin is is a biomedical scientist in the lab technician. And yeah, she's told me about her work day a whole bunch of times. And yeah, doctors are they're all like, right, I'm working overtime going down to the lab, everyone. And I can't get over it now. Because it's every episode, that's kind of the bulk of every episode of that show is them investigating things with the lab equipment.
I'll tell you what you'll love. So in my reading for the Crime Awards this year, there were two books, which again, I can't remember what they were, so I can't name them, which is probably a good thing. Two books where they portray people who are either on YouTube or who are kind of like either bloggers or vloggers or podcasters as somehow just like sitting in front of a camera and just filming themselves chatting and then immediately posting it online and then getting like 5,000 views in the first 10 minutes.
Oh my God.
And I'm like, people have a really weird view of what it actually means to do other people's jobs. I think people kind of like see the surface of other people's jobs, but they don't really understand quite often what. It's one of the reasons why they tell you to like, write what you know when you're writing and stuff, I think, because otherwise you have to do research on this stuff, because otherwise you get it wildly wrong. There was the one I was reading the other day did have that. It was she literally recorded a video on her phone, just speaking straight to camera, no edits or anything, posted it, and within like 10 minutes she'd had 5,000 views.
Oh, if only that would be nice. God, the editing part for me takes forever, and I'm only really editing out patches where all of a sudden my mind's and I just sat there silently for a minute going, what was I talking about? I try to edit out. I say and like a lot because I'm just coming up with what I'm saying as I'm saying it, and that that's how people talk. But when you actually watch yourself doing it, it gets really annoying. I'm like, oh, that's annoying me. I'm gonna have to cut it, or it's gonna annoy everyone else. But yeah, I would love 5,000 views in 10 minutes. That would be, or even 10 days. That would be great.
I was like, if it was that easy, everyone would do it.
Yeah. That's why you don't go on YouTube unless you actually love what you're doing.
Yeah.
Because if you go on here for money, you're gonna cry. Give me a sad time. Yes, the author interview part of Happy Goat is my favorite single part that I get to do now. Get to talk to people like yourself and get your wisdom and knowledge that I'm absorbing. And I think that people are going to really love this one with you, Dan, especially the authors, in that watch these videos, because you've been quite the fountain of knowledge for anthology submissions. And
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. I think the one thing I do have to offer on that kind of front, and I say it often when I'm on panels and stuff, is that I do both because I'm a writer, but I'm also an editor.
yeah,
It's quite useful to get that view from kind of both sides of the table, because I know what it's like for both sides. So I know what it's like being an author and sending stuff off and getting it rejected and going, oh, how dare they, god damn it. And then, but equally, I am also the editor sitting on the other side of the desk who's just had 800 submissions in.
you have to reject hundreds of people. That's the worst part of anthology editing for me, is having to send the rejections
It
out.
is on the whole. I mean, on occasion, there have been a few in the past where I've been quite happy to reject them. Just been like, yeah, that one's not going in for whatever reason. Normally, just because it's completely unsuitable.
Yeah.
So, you know, those are quite easy to get rid of. But it's all those ones in the middle, the hard bit. It's those ones that are actually well written, and you can tell someone's taken some time on it, and they've done a good job, and they can tell a story, and their writing is solid. But it just doesn't like sparkle.
Yeah.
It's just not good enough to make that tiny like 0.5% that's actually going to go in.
So it was worse for me is when it is good enough to go in, but there simply isn't room. So you have to pick the sparkliest, but they could, and there's different factors that go into that. Like, oh, do we already have a first person story? Well, that, yeah, and you have to start making decisions with like that. And also, if you're active in the bookish scene as you are, you're going to get submissions from people that you're friends with.
Yeah.
That you have to
Absolutely.
go, sorry, no.
Yeah, I've had to reject many friends over the years. I mean, I'm not doing many open submissions anymore. I'm doing a lot fewer open submissions, just because if you're dealing with bigger publishers, they generally want to know who the names attached are before you even sign a contract with them. And so you obviously that doesn't work with open submissions because you don't know who the people are going to be. So, you can do a mix of them. Quite a few people do a mix, much like Mark does with his Flame Tree one. So he gets his invited authors and then he has his 4 spots to fill, which is a good way around it. But even then, you're then letting down 796 people.
I just realised how long I've kept you here, so I'm going to have to let you go. But my last, well, I say let you go, release you from my clutches so you can get on with the rest of your day. But my last question is, do you have a single favourite project that you've worked on to date, whether it's a piece of your own writing or something you've edited?
There are probably 2. One is the Mythago Wood anthology, Heartwood. I mean, I've said to numerous people that I feel it might be the best thing I've done, and best in multiple ways. I kind of feel like it's interesting and complex and has some really good stories in it, but equally, like we did something really kind of nice and worthwhile, and it kind of reinforced that sense of community and stuff that we all like, kind of going to the conventions and things. So that felt really nice, and it's a lovely looking book at the end of the day as well, which also helps. The other one was the anthology This Dreaming Isle that I did, which actually I've got a copy up there. So there's This Dreaming Isle. This Dreaming Isle. So that also was that was kind of the first big thing that I had out. That was the one that got shortlisted for the Shirley Jackson Award and the British Fantasy Award. And at the time I was like a nobody. I'd like self-published a handful of kind of journals and anthologies myself and stuff, and I had a bit of writing published. But that has just had a life of its own. I mean, Unsung no longer going as a publisher, so it's now out of print. Well, if anyone wants a copy, I do have some. But it's still absolutely got a life of its own. I went up to talk to some students and do a panel at York St John University a couple of years ago, only to discover that they were being taught it on their course. And they actually studied like my introduction and Jen Ashworth's story in it, and I think another story that I can't remember which one. And so they actually all kind of like knew who I was because they'd studied this book. So yeah, that's had an absolute life of its own. Another fantasy writer who I approached for another project immediately said yes to me when I asked him if he wanted to write something for me, because he loved This Dreaming Isle and thought it was like one of the best anthologies of the last decade and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, this was like a little idea that I had like years and years ago that just seems to have been the thing that springboarded kind of everything that I've done since. So yeah, still really proud of that one.
Well, you should be, and that's a good lesson for people. This is what happens when you actually really love what you're doing and you work really hard at it. You know, people notice So yeah, well, I felt it. I really felt it with Heartwood. I could tell how much effort and time and just I like conceptually, I was like, oh, this is someone that loves this this story.
No, actually, I gave myself a literal migraine
Oh,
working out the sequence of stories for that book, because I was trying to do multiple things at once, so that they kind of move from the outside of the wood and kind of as far away as possible to getting closer and closer to the middle of the wood. But also there are a number of stories in there that take place at Oak Lodge, which is in the original book. And I wanted those to be in sequence as well, so to be chronologically correct as it went through, and trying to fit all the stories so they all worked and nothing was kind of next to something that it jarred against or whatever, but at the same time went kind of like from geographically far away to close in, but also chronologically
yeah.
far away to present day. Yeah, it gave me a literal migraine. I had to take an afternoon off to sit out
Oh,
from it because
oh.
I couldn't work it out. I think I
But
got there in the end though.
yes, yes, it's so well put together and so enjoyable and yeah. Well, I'm gonna put the link for that in the description, and then all of your where people can find you and stalk you on the internet. So I'll just make sure that Dan's information, all of his information, is right there for everyone to find. Put your home address on there, and that was a joke. You froze for a second, then I was like, wait, no, just joking. All of your accessible information that you want people to have, I will put in the description. Yes, and I'm hoping that things go well with the republish of Come Sing for the Harrowing, because it's such a great book. And
I'm hopeful. They were keen before Christmas. We'll see what happens.
oh yes, well, I'll keep my fingers crossed for you, and let me know, and we can do a little promotional piece for it for the relaunch, Dan.
Yes, hopefully.
Yes. Okay, so gonna sign off for the audience now, and thank you again for doing this, Dan. I really appreciate it. And we're going to sign off with our regular little goatee sign off, which is bleat.